On the morning of May the 6th, 1945, General George S. Patton stood at the boundary of what his army had crossed in less time than the German military had needed to plan its response to the advance. The city of Pilsen lay behind him. The Skoda works, which had spent 5 years producing armored vehicles for the Wehrmacht, were already flying white flags. 47 miles to the east, across the rolling hills of western Bohemia, the Czech capital of Prague was on its 4th day of open revolt. The uprising had begun on May the 5th. Czech partisans had seized the city's main radio transmitter and were broadcasting appeals in every language they could reach. The announcements said the same thing in English, in French, in German. Come now, or there will be nothing left to come to. German SS units were fighting street to street through the old quarter. The transmitters repeated the message on the hour, every hour. American forces were close. Third Army was the closest. Patton's lead elements were at the line Eisenhower had assigned them, and his formal request to advance beyond that line, to move east toward Prague, had been transmitted to Supreme Allied headquarters that morning. If you're finding this story compelling, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. The answer came back within the hour. No, the line held. Prague was not Third Army's objective. According to an agreement between the Allied powers and the Soviet Union, confirmed through the combined chiefs of staff, the Czech capital would be reached by forces under Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front, still approximately 150 miles to the east. Patton did not accept this quietly. His diary from those days, preserved in the collection that became the foundation of Martin Blumenson's exhaustive 2-volume edition of his papers, records his private assessment in language not intended for any reader other than himself. He understood, with the precision of a man who had spent 4 decades studying military situations, exactly what the halt order produced. Soviet forces would enter Prague. The Czechs who had broadcast those hourly appeals, who had gambled their lives on American intervention, would find themselves in a different kind of occupation than the one they had just risen against. The political boundary between liberated Europe and Soviet-occupied Europe will be settled not by military reality, but by decisions made above his command, by men who, in his view, were making those decisions without fully understanding what they were conceding. What Patton could not have known, and what the Allied High Command took care to ensure remained outside his official awareness, was the specific content of the intelligence assessments being prepared in Moscow at that same hour, in buildings he would never see and in a language he did not speak. Those assessments, portions of which became accessible to Western historians following the partial opening of Soviet archives after 1991, tell the story that Allied leadership kept carefully quiet throughout the war and in the years that followed. They tell the story of which American general the Soviet leadership was watching most closely throughout the final year of the European War. It was not Dwight D. Eisenhower. To understand what that Soviet assessment looked like and why it was drawn in the terms it was, it is necessary to understand what the Soviet strategic mind had been trained to evaluate in an opposing commander. The Soviet military system, shaped by 2 decades of Stalinist doctrine and tested under conditions on the Eastern Front that cost the country approximately 27 million dead, had developed specific criteria for evaluating enemy commanders. Tactical competence was one category. Political reliability was another, and it was the category that mattered most from a long-term strategic perspective. A tactically brilliant commander who operated within the constraints his political masters assigned him was a commander Moscow could plan against. A tactically brilliant commander who did not was something else entirely. Eisenhower scored well in both categories, in the precise sense that Soviet intelligence used those terms. On tactical competence, he was rated sound, a capable organizer, a manager of complex coalitions, a commander who understood the relationship between supply and operational reach. On political reliability, meaning the degree to which his decisions were predictable and shaped by institutional and alliance constraints, he was rated as essentially cooperative. Soviet intelligence classified him as a political general. That phrase was not an insult in the Soviet analytical vocabulary. It was a specific technical designation, meaning that his decisions were structured by alliance considerations, by the need to maintain relationships with London and Washington and with the Soviet Union itself, and that he consistently placed those relationships above the temptation to pursue immediate tactical advantage at their expense. He could be worked with. His limits could be mapped. He understood that the war had diplomatic dimensions that extended beyond any single military operation, and he never forgot them. Patton received a different classification. Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, had maintained files on every senior Allied commander in the European theater since before the United States entered the war. By 1944, these files had grown into what the Soviet system termed operational profiles. Detailed assessments of how each commander behaved under pressure, how closely he adhered to orders when those orders conflicted with his own judgment, and how he spoke about the Soviet Union in settings he believed were restricted from outside observation. The Patton file was exceptional in two respects that pulled in opposite directions. On operational competence, the Soviet assessment was without qualification. He was rated the most dangerous commander in the Western Allied order of battle. No other Allied general in the European theater received that designation in unqualified form. The reasoning was specific and grounded in documented performance. In the 9 months between the Normandy breakout in August of 1944 and the halt of the Czech border in May of 1945, Third Army had advanced through France, Luxembourg, Belgium, Germany, and into Austria and Czechoslovakia, accounting for approximately 1,200,000 prisoners of war and the operational collapse of German formations across a front that stretched across several hundred miles of Western Europe. The pace of that advance was not merely impressive by Western Allied standards. The Soviet military, which had conducted some of the largest armored operations in the history of warfare on the Eastern Front, recognized in what Patton had done something that belonged in a category defined by very few commanders in the history of modern war. What they recognized specifically was that Patton operated on the same fundamental principles that had made the best Soviet armored commanders successful on the Eastern Front. He understood that speed was a strategic weapon in itself, independent of the tactical situation it immediately created. Then advance pressed fast enough could collapse an opponent's will to resist faster than that opponent could reinforce, regroup, or receive new orders. He understood that the supply chain was a problem to be solved in motion rather than a constraint to be observed before moving. He understood, in the way that very few Western Allied commanders of his generation understood it, that the psychological momentum of a force advancing beyond what the enemy believed sustainable was itself a form of armament. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who met Patton at a ceremony in Berlin in the summer of 1945, noted in his memoirs that Patton had reminded him of something he could not define at first, and then recognized, of himself in the early years of the war. Before the institutional frameworks of a large army had introduced the constraints that discipline and political supervision imposed on how fast a commander was willing to push. Zhukov was writing for Soviet readers in a context where there was no diplomatic reason to compliment an American general. The observation was a professional one. One soldier reading another across the distance of different armies, different theaters, different languages, and reaching a precise conclusion about what he saw. The second element of the Soviet assessment of Patton was the element that translated into active policy concern, and it was not his tactical ability. It was the question of what he would do if the political constraints that his government had placed on him were removed, loosened, or simply outrun by a fast-moving situation on the ground. On this question, Soviet intelligence had accumulated substantial material by the spring of 1945. Patton's private statements about the Soviet Union, gathered through sources within Allied headquarters and through the analysis of communications that circulated within Third Army's command structure, were consistent across every document Soviet analyst had access to. He did not regard the Soviet Union as an ally in any sense that extended beyond the immediate necessity of defeating Germany. He regarded the wartime alliance as a temporary expedient, and he regarded the political leadership of the United States as fundamentally mistaken in treating it as anything more. He watched Soviet forces extend their control across Eastern Europe as German resistance collapsed in the West, and he identified in what they were doing not the legitimate security concerns of a nation that had absorbed the largest land invasion in history, but the systematic operational preparation of a power that intended to hold what it was taking and to move for more when the current adversary was finished. His diary from the final months of the European War reads, in retrospect, almost like a strategic assessment written from inside the opposing camp. In entries from March and April of 1945, Patton noted that the United States and Britain were on the verge of confronting a Soviet Union that had acquired the territory, the industrial base, and the political infrastructure to become the dominant power on the European continent, and that the window for altering that outcome was measured in weeks rather than years. He observed that the halt orders he continued to receive, which slowed Third Army and redirected its operational axis away from the areas where Soviet consolidation was proceeding fastest, were not military decisions in any meaningful sense. They were political decisions made by people who either did not understand what those decisions were producing or had concluded that what they were producing was acceptable. This was not a commander speculating beyond his proper domain. Patton had studied military history more systematically than almost any officer of his generation, and he understood with reasonable clarity that what the Soviet Union was doing in Eastern Europe in the spring of 1945 was not improvised. He said so in the private record he kept with the same directness he applied to everything else. And the Soviet intelligence apparatus that processed summaries of his views understood exactly what kind of commander it was looking at. Their conclusion was straightforward. Patton, if given political authorization to act on his military instincts, would not stop at the line Eisenhower had assigned him. He would not stop at Prague. He would not stop anywhere that he had not been given a specific, documented order to stop from a commander whose authority he recognized, in a situation where stopping made operational sense. The question was whether the American government would ever give him that authorization, and the Soviet reading of American politics in the spring of 1945 suggested that it almost certainly would not. Almost certainly. That small uncertainty, the gap between what Patton wanted and what his government would permit, was precisely what Stalin was managing. Not the certainty of American aggression, but the possibility of it, and the specific location of that possibility inside one man and one army. If this story is landing with you, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep producing work like this. Prague fell to Soviet forces on May the 9th, 1945, 3 days after Patton's halt order and 4 days after the Czech partisans had broadcast their first appeals for help. The German garrison surrendered to Konev's troops rather than to the Americans who had been 47 miles to the west when the fighting was at its worst. What followed in Prague and throughout Czechoslovakia in the years after the war belongs to the documented history of what Soviet occupation produced. The systematic elimination of non-communist political structures, the show trials of the early 1950s, the Soviet tanks that returned in 1968, the 4 decades of enforced dependence on Moscow that would not fully end until 1989. Whether a different decision at Pilsen in May of 1945 would have changed any of that is a genuine historical argument that continues among serious historians and does not resolve cleanly in either direction. What is not in dispute is that the Allied leadership made that decision with awareness of its consequences, and that those consequences were, for the political architects of Allied strategy, an acceptable cost. For Patton, they were not. He spent the final weeks of the European war in a state of barely contained frustration directed not at the Germans, who were finished, but the framework of decisions being made above his head. He wrote in his diary that the West was handing the Soviet Union a Europe it had not entirely earned on the battlefield, and that the cost of that gift would not become visible for years. He was right about the cost. He was wrong about the timeline. It became visible almost immediately. The question of what happened to him in the months after the war ended, and who was most invested in ensuring the permanent silence of the only Allied commander the Soviet Union genuinely feared, begins in the summer of 1945. It begins with a German town, a press conference, and a single sentence that ended the career of the most effective armored commander the United States Army has ever produced. The summer of 1945 placed George Patton in a role for which his entire career had prepared him in almost every respect except one. As military governor of Bavaria, he commanded the largest American occupation zone in Germany. The physical mechanics of that command were within his gifts. The political mechanics were not, and the gap between those two realities produced the final act of his public life with a momentum that, in retrospect, looks almost inevitable. Bavaria in the summer of 1945 was a ruined landscape administered by whatever human infrastructure had survived the war. The cities were damaged, some severely. The local government apparatus had been built over 12 years around the personnel and the organizational logic of the National Socialist system, and dismantling that system while continuing to provide food, water, sanitation, and the basic operations of civil order was not a problem that had a clean solution. Patton's approach to denazification, the systematic removal from public life of those who had held formal membership in or active association with the Nazi Party, was pragmatic in a way his critics called corrupt and his defenders called realistic. He retained in administrative positions men with Nazi Party memberships who also had specific technical knowledge that, in his judgment, was needed to prevent the collapse of civil administration in the zone he was responsible for governing. His argument was not without merit as a practical matter. The alternative to using former party members in administrative roles was either to import administrators from outside Germany, a resource that did not exist in sufficient numbers, or to operate with a level of administrative competence that would have produced genuine humanitarian failures in a zone containing several million people. The denazification policy written in Washington and transmitted through Supreme Allied headquarters did not account for this problem in any operationally useful way. Patton was solving a real problem with the tools available to him. What he was also doing, with a consistency that his subordinates recognized and that his critics were assembling into a pattern he did not fully see, was expressing in increasingly direct language his view that the people being retained in Bavarian administrative positions were less dangerous to American interests than the forces that would fill the vacuum if they were removed. The Soviet Union was consolidating its position throughout Eastern Europe throughout the summer of 1945. Patton watched this happen and drew the inference that he had drawn since the final weeks of the war. He communicated that inference to people he trusted in conversations that were not private in any way that military headquarters conversations are private. His view was simple, documented, and consistent. The Soviet Union was not a partner in any enterprise that the United States should be comfortable with. The German administrative structure in Bavaria represented a potential institutional counterweight to Soviet influence in Central Europe, and the denazification policy as written was, in effect, destroying that counterweight at the moment it was most needed. The Soviet intelligence apparatus, which had maintained an active presence throughout the Allied occupation zones and which was receiving reports from sources within the Allied administrative structure, was following this argument with close attention. What they saw was not merely a military governor making pragmatic administrative decisions. What they saw was a senior American commander articulating, in explicit terms, the strategic framework that would underpin any future American policy of confrontation with the Soviet Union. Patton was not just keeping Nazis in administrative jobs. He was building, on however small a scale, the institutional preconditions for a different kind of European politics, one in which the former German state apparatus became a functional partner of the Western powers rather than a destroyed relic of the regime that had just been defeated. The Soviet response to this was communicated through diplomatic channels with a specificity that is documented in the records of the period. Soviet officials raised the question of Patton's administration of Bavaria in conversations with American diplomatic counterparts in the summer of 1945 on multiple occasions. They noted the retention of former Nazi officials. They noted the tone of his public statements. They noted, with an accuracy that was itself evidence of the quality of their intelligence collection, the content of private conversations he had held within his command structure. The formal diplomatic language of those complaints was measured. The underlying message was not. Patton was being identified as an obstacle to the post-war order that the Soviet Union intended to build, and Moscow was making that identification known to Washington. This was the context into which the press conference at Bad Tolls arrived on the 22nd of September 1945. The circumstances of that press conference were not unusual by the standards of the occupation period. Patton had given many. He was comfortable with journalists in the way that commanders who trust their own judgment are often comfortable with journalists. Not cautious in the way that produces careful non-answers, but direct in the way that sometimes produces more truth than the occasion can absorb. What he said that morning in response to a question about denazification policy produced a political explosion that reached Washington within hours and reached Moscow within the same day. The exact phrasing has been quoted in several variants across the years since, but the essential content is not disputed. A reporter pressed him on the policy of retaining former Nazi Party members in Bavarian administrative positions. Patton's response compared Nazi Party membership to membership in a political party in the American domestic context, suggesting that the vast majority of those enrolled in the party had done so for professional and social reasons rather than ideological commitment, in the same way that Americans affiliated with a political party for reasons that had nothing to do with policy conviction. He suggested that the denazification policy, applied mechanically, was removing the administrative capacity of the zone without replacing it. The comparison to American political party membership was, as political errors go, nearly complete in the damage it inflicted. It translated, in the press cables that went out that afternoon, into a headline that stated that Patton had compared Nazis to Republicans and Democrats. The headline was reductive, but not entirely unfair to the underlying remark. The resulting coverage was immediate, widespread, and unambiguous in its verdict on what he had said. What mattered historically was not the press coverage. What mattered was the specific combination of pressures that the Bad Tolls press conference assembled in one place at one moment. Truman's administration was managing a public narrative about the meaning of the war just ended, one in which the Nazi regime was defined by its crimes, and the denazification policy was presented as the instrument of justice that the Allied victory had made possible. Patton's remarks cut directly against that narrative in a way that was politically indefensible from Washington's position. At the same time, the Soviet diplomatic complaints about Patton's administration of Bavaria, which had been accumulating since July, now had a specific and very public event to point to. And within Allied headquarters, Eisenhower was managing the consequences of a senior commander who had, over the course of 4 months, made himself the single most politically inconvenient figure in the occupation structure. Eisenhower met with Patton on the 28th of September. The accounts of that meeting that exist in the historical record, primarily in the memoirs and papers of participants and in Patton's own diary, are consistent in their general outline. Eisenhower told Patton that his remarks at Bad Tolls had been damaging and that the political situation required change. He did not use the language of dismissal. He offered Patton command of the 15th Army, which in the organizational structure of the occupation forces carried the same nominal prestige as 3rd Army, but had been converted into a historical research unit tasked with writing the official account of the European campaign. It had no operational troops. It had no territory to govern. It had no function except to document what had already been done. Patton understood precisely what was being offered. His diary from those days records his assessment with the same directness he applied to every military situation he analyzed. He recognized that he was being removed from any position in which his judgment, his statements, or his instincts about the Soviet Union could affect policy or operations. He recognized that the combination of pressures on Eisenhower was genuine. That Eisenhower was not acting purely from personal calculation, but from the weight of political forces that had made Patton's position untenable in ways that extended beyond any individual decision either of them might make. He accepted the reassignment. He did not accept the underlying judgment that produced it, and he said so in the private record. On the 2nd of October, 1945, George Patton handed command of 3rd Army to General Lucian Truscott. The ceremony was brief. What Patton said publicly at the handover was measured and military in its restraint. What he wrote in his diary that night was not. He was 60 years old. He had commanded an army in the most sustained armored advance in American military history. He was being given a desk and an assignment to write about what other men's armies had done. He wrote that he had come to understand, in the course of the summer that the true cost of the Allied victory was not yet visible to the people who had the power to respond to it, and that by the time it became visible, it would be too late to respond to it at the cost at which a response was currently available. He wrote that this conclusion had become so clear to him that continuing in his present role had become essentially pointless. He had already begun, in conversations with people he trusted, to discuss resigning his commission. This is the element of the final weeks of his life that requires the most careful handling, because it touches the question that has surrounded his death since the day it happened, and that remains, after 80 years, genuinely without a definitive answer. The documented record of what Patton planned to do after resigning is limited but not absent. The people he discussed it with, including General Frederick Eyre, his brother-in-law, and several officers within his circle, later recorded their recollections of those conversations. The consistent thread is that Patton intended to speak publicly about what he believed the Allied leadership had conceded to the Soviet Union in the final weeks of the war and in the occupation period, about the Czech decision and the specific political agreements that had structured the halt of Third Army at Pilsen, and about his assessment of what Soviet intentions in Europe were and what they would produce. He intended, in other words, to say publicly everything that he had been saying privately since March of 1945. He was the most credentialed military voice in the United States on the subject of the European war's final weeks. He had been there. He had fought the campaign. He had seen the halt orders. He had watched the Soviet consolidation proceed in the territory that his army had been positioned to reach first. He had formed a specific judgment about what it meant and what should be done about it, and he was no longer bound, by the time he had decided to resign, by the institutional constraints that had required him to limit that judgment to his private diary. The Soviet intelligence assessment of this situation is not difficult to reconstruct, because the general contours of what Soviet intelligence was tracking about Patton in the fall of 1945 are documented in the accounts of former Soviet intelligence officers that became available after the Cold War's end. Patton represented, from Moscow's perspective, a specific and bounded threat that the American political system had managed through the removal of his command. That removal reduced the threat, but did not eliminate it. A Patton with no commission and no institutional obligations was, in certain respects, more dangerous than a Patton constrained by military hierarchy. He could say what he actually thought. He had the credibility and the public recognition to be heard. And what he thought, as Moscow's assessment of his views had established with considerable precision over the preceding year, was exactly the argument that the Soviet Union most needed not to be made in the American public arena in the winter of 1945. On the 9th of December, 1945, Patton left his quarters in Bad Nauheim before 9 o'clock in the morning for a pheasant shoot outside Mannheim. He traveled in a 1941 Cadillac Model 75 staff car. General Hobart Gay, his chief of staff, rode with him. Their route took them through the outskirts of Mannheim on roads that were in the condition typical of occupied Germany at that period, cleared but still partly damaged, carrying mixed military and civilian traffic at speeds and under conditions of control that were inconsistent by peacetime standards. At approximately 11:45 in the morning, at a road intersection near Kuferdal, a United States Army 2.5-ton truck driven by Technical Sergeant Robert Thompson made a left turn across the path of Patton's staff car. The collision was low speed by the standards of motor accidents. Patton was thrown forward in the car. He struck the partition between the rear passenger compartment and the driver's section. General Gay and Patton's driver, Private First Class Horace Woodring, were uninjured. Patton was not. He was conscious and alert immediately after the impact. He told Gay that he thought he was paralyzed. He was right. The injury was a fracture and dislocation of the third and fourth cervical vertebrae, producing complete paralysis below the shoulders. He was taken first to the 35th Evacuation Hospital in Heidelberg, and then, as the severity of his condition became clear, to the main medical facility at Heidelberg, where a team of specialists, including the neurosurgeon Lieutenant Colonel Paul Pittman, was assembled to manage his care. His wife, Beatrice, flew from the United States and arrived in Heidelberg on the 11th of December. He died on the 21st of December, 1945, The cause was pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure, the consequence of complications in a man of 60 whose body had been managing a spinal cord injury for 12 days. He was buried, at his own request, with the men of Third Army who had died in the battle for Luxembourg. He had specified that he did not want to be buried in the United States, and that he did not want a separate grave. What he had commanded in life, he wanted to accompany in death. The questions that gathered around the accident have never fully dispersed. They are documented in the historical literature, most comprehensively in Robert Wilcox's examination published in 2008, which drew on the account of a former Office of Strategic Services operative named Douglas Bazata, who claimed, in a series of statements made in the 1970s and subsequently, to have been involved in a plot to kill Patton. The Bazata claim has been examined by historians and has not been established as credible by the documentary standards that the historical record requires. The physical evidence of the accident is consistent with an ordinary road collision of the kind that was occurring with considerable frequency on occupied German roads in the winter of 1945. The truck driver, Thompson, was investigated at the time, found to have acted through error rather than intent, and was not charged. What the historical record does establish, without requiring any inference beyond the documented evidence, is the following. In December of 1945, the only Allied commander that Soviet intelligence had rated as their most dangerous opponent, who had publicly expressed his intention to resign his commission and speak freely about what he believed the Allied leadership had conceded to the Soviet Union, died in a low-speed automobile accident that produced injuries normally survived by men 20 years younger, 12 days before he was planning to return to the United States. The Last Order's audience, which reads the historical record with the same seriousness the channel brings to presenting it, is entitled to hold both of those things in mind at once without being told what conclusion to draw from them. The evidence for accident is stronger than the evidence for anything else. The circumstances that made a retired Patton a specific political concern of Moscow are documented independently of any theory about the accident itself. History does not always resolve its most charged questions, and a responsible approach to this one is to present both the documented facts and the documented context without collapsing either into the other. What is not in question is what happened after he died, and what the Allied leadership chose to do with the arguments he had spent his final months preparing to make. They vanished. The denazification controversy that had driven his removal from Third Army Command became, in the public record, a story about a brilliant but undisciplined commander who had said something politically embarrassing and paid the appropriate institutional price. The private views he had expressed about Soviet intentions, which were shared in varying degrees by Churchill, and which would be articulated publicly by Churchill at Fulton, Missouri, in March of 1946, were not attributed to Patton. His diaries were not published until 1947, and were published in an edited form that reduced the sharpest of his political observations. The full version, including the complete text of his entries from the spring and summer of 1945, did not reach the public in scholarly form until Blumenson's exhaustive edition appeared in 1974. The Soviet intelligence assessment of Patton, portions of which became accessible in the period following the Cold War, records his death in terms that are spare and professional. The entry in the relevant file notes the accident and death and records the conclusion that the threat he represented had been resolved without the need for Soviet action. Whether that last phrase means that Moscow believed the accident was genuinely accidental, or that it was an event whose resolution aligned with Soviet interests regardless of its origin, is a question the documents themselves do not answer. Soviet intelligence documentation of this period was not written for the purpose of answering questions that its authors believed would eventually be read by historians outside their own system. It was written with the economy of professional notation. The situation changed. The change was advantageous. The file was closed. Eisenhower's relationship to the events of those final months of Patton's life has also been examined by historians with more rigor than the popular narrative accommodates. The two men had known each other since West Point, had served together in the interwar years, and had maintained through the entire European campaign a relationship of professional respect and personal friction that defined the limits of what each one was willing to accept from the other. Eisenhower's decision to relieve Patton in October was not driven by anything resembling personal animus. It was driven by the reality that Patton had become a political liability that the occupation administration could not absorb. The political pressures generating that liability came from multiple directions simultaneously. The domestic American reaction to his denazification remarks, the Truman administration's need to manage the public narrative about the war's meaning, and the Soviet diplomatic complaints that had been accumulating for months. Whether Eisenhower was conscious of the degree to which the Soviet pressure was shaping the political environment in which he was making his decision is a question about what he knew, and when he knew it, that the available documents do not resolve with precision. What his decision produced, regardless of its motivation, was the permanent silencing of the one Allied commander who had seen the Prague decision and its consequences from close enough to describe them with operational specificity. Eisenhower went on to command the post-war alliance structure, to serve as military governor in the occupation period, and eventually to serve 2 terms as President of the United States. His public account of the final weeks of the European War and of the decisions made about Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe was shaped throughout by the considerations of a man managing an alliance. His private account, as available in his papers, is more candid than his public record, but is still the account of a man who believed that the decisions taken were, on balance, unavoidable. Patton's account, had he lived to give it, would have been different. It would have been the account of the commander who had been stopped at Pilsen and told that Prague was not his objective, who had watched the Czech partisans broadcast for 4 days without authorization to respond, and who had spent the summer and autumn of 1945 watching the political consequences of that halt consolidate into the shape of what became the Iron Curtain. He would not have framed his argument in diplomatic language. He would have framed it in the language of military fact. Here is where my army was. Here is what I was ordered not to do. Here is what happened because I was ordered not to do it. The Soviet fear of Patton was, in its most fundamental dimension, the fear of exactly that account delivered by exactly that voice at exactly the moment when the political architecture of the post-war world was still fluid enough to be contested. Stalin's understanding of political power included the understanding that narratives about historical events shape the public will in ways that military force could not, and that the narrative of the European war's final weeks was still, in the winter of 1945, being written. A Patton who had resigned his commission and returned to the United States was a man who would begin writing his version of that narrative immediately. He had the credibility. He had the documented record. He had the specific operational knowledge that no other Allied commander possessed of what Third Army had been positioned to do and why it had been stopped. That voice was not raised. The argument he had prepared was never delivered. The diplomatic framework that made Prague into a Soviet city for 44 years was never publicly contested by the commander who had been 47 miles from Prague when it mattered most. Whether that outcome was produced by chance, by institutional decision, or by something more deliberate, is a question the historical record leaves open in the specific and uncomfortable way that the most significant questions sometimes do. What the record does not leave open is why, of all the Allied commanders in the European theater, the one whose death produced that outcome was the one that Moscow had rated as its most serious concern. History does not always supply clean answers to the questions it raises. The last order's promise is not to resolve what cannot be resolved, but to present what can be documented, to place it in the context it actually occupied, and to trust the audience to hold the weight of what that context implies. Patton was the most effective armored commander the United States Army has ever fielded in sustained combat operations. He was the only Allied general that Soviet military intelligence rated as genuinely dangerous on the same terms the Soviet system used to evaluate its own best commanders. He was removed from command at the precise moment his private views were becoming too consequential to contain within the institutional structure that had, until that point, managed to contain them. And he died before he could act on his stated intention to speak publicly. In circumstances that remain, after 8 decades, precisely ambiguous. He is buried in Luxembourg among the men of Third Army, which is where he said he wanted to be. The grave is marked with the same white cross that marks theirs. A man who commanded 350,000 soldiers at the height of Third Army's reach, who covered more ground faster than any army in the history of the Western Front, lies in a field among the men who died making that advance possible, without a separate monument and without a separate designation. That is the ending he chose. What he would have said, had he lived long enough to say it, is the ending history did not supply. Thank you for watching. For more stories like this one, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.